Night fell upon a world unnamed, a world unknown. The gentle, ethereal luminescence of Eden, a light that seemed to emanate from every leaf and blade of grass, was gone. In its place was a profound darkness, carrying a biting cold of alienation that seeped into their very bones. Adam and Eve walked, but their steps were no longer the light, carefree strides upon soft carpets of grass. Their feet now met the unyielding, stony earth, each footfall a painful reminder of an irreversible change. Their hands no longer intertwined. Between them lay an invisible void, a silence as heavy as lead, a chasm that had never before existed. Only hours ago, they were one, a perfect union, bone of bone and flesh of flesh, their souls merged in a symphony of pure love. Now, that silence was a wall, built from the bricks of shame, regret, and an unspoken accusation. Behind them, a fiery point against the horizon, the gate of the Garden of Eden was forever sealed. The light emanating from it was not a warm invitation, but the blazing, turning sword of a cherubim, an eternal, searing brand upon their minds of all they had forfeited. Adam glanced at Eve, the woman he had joyfully proclaimed, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh," now walked beside him like a phantom. In her eyes, he no longer saw untainted adoration, no longer the reflection of a perfect man, but a deep, haunting fear and shame. Her long hair was not caressed by the fragrant Edenic breezes, but was tossed chaotically by a cold, wild wind. The coats of skins, which the Creator himself had fashioned for them, felt less like a provision of care and more like a mark of their defilement, a necessary covering for a nakedness of body and soul they had only just discovered. Did they dare to look back? Could they bear to face the vanishing image of paradise, where every memory was now a bleeding wound? Or could they only press forward, bearing on their shoulders the crushing weight of a single, calamitous decision that had irrevocably altered the course of humanity? This was not the beginning of a journey of discovery. It was the commencement of an exile not just from a land, but from the very presence of the one who had breathed life into them. The tender call, "Adam, where are you?" from that fateful afternoon now lingered only as a distant echo in their minds, a question they would have to answer for the rest of their lives. They did not know where they were going. They only knew they could never return. The night sky above was not a familiar, sparkling canopy, but a vast, indifferent void, filled with mysteries and threats. They, the first two humans, were now also the first two exiles, the first two lonely souls, taking the first steps on a long, arduous path defined by sorrow, toil, and a fragile hope they did not yet dare to name. They found a temporary refuge under a jagged rock outcropping, a shallow cave where the night wind could not assail them with its full fury. Adam, with a newfound, instinctual knowledge he did not understand, managed to coax a small flame from dry sticks. The flickering light danced across their faces, casting long, distorted shadows on the rock wall shadows that seemed to mock their solitude. Sleep, once a gentle and seamless transition in the garden, was now a reluctant visitor. When they closed their eyes, memory was not a comfort but a torment. Memories returned not as a gentle stream, but as a torrential flood, threatening to drown them. Adam remembered the cool of the day, walking with God through the garden, the sound of his voice both majestic and intimate. He had been given the honor, the profound responsibility of naming every living creature, a testament to the trust and fellowship they shared. He recalled the feel of the soft earth under his feet, the scent of blossoms no human has smelled since, and the absolute peace of knowing he was exactly where he was meant to be. Now, these pristine recollections only served to amplify the stark emptiness of his new reality. His hands, which had once tended perfect flora, were now scraped and raw. Eve was adrift in her own sea of remembrance. She saw the moment she first opened her eyes to the world, beheld Adam, and understood she was made for him, from him. She remembered the rivers that flowed, sparkling and pure, and the animals that gathered around her without fear. The lion would lie down beside the lamb, and she could run her fingers through their manes. Every flower in the garden seemed to bloom more brightly as she passed, but the most piercing memory was of the tree. She could still hear the serpent's silken, venomous whisper, "You will not certainly die. Your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God." The promise of enlightenment had become a curse of exposure. They had lost more than a home. They had lost an integral part of their being. Shame covered them like an invisible, heavy cloak. For the first time, they felt insecure, vulnerable to the world and to each other. The rustle of leaves in the night was no longer a friendly creature stirring. It was a potential threat. The first pangs of hunger were not a gentle call to an abundant feast, but an urgent, gnawing need. They tried to speak, but words seemed to lodge in their throats. Adam wanted to ask, "Why did you listen to him?" But he knew he too had reached for the fruit. Eve wanted to cry out, "Why did you not stop me?" But she knew it was she who had offered the invitation to sin. So they remained silent, each imprisoned in their private theater of memory. The burden of what was became the chains that bound them to a perfect past they could never reclaim. And in that first, long night outside of Eden, they learned the painful paradox that even with only 2 people in the entire world, they had never felt more alone. The sun rose over a barren horizon, its light no longer filtered through the lush canopy of Eden, but beating down with a harsh, unforgiving intensity. The Creator's pronouncement of judgment was no longer an echo, but was now being etched into their daily existence. Adam, his hands bare and armed only with a crudely sharpened branch, began humanity's first labor, the conquest of the soil. The patch of ground he chose, near their rocky shelter, was as hard as stone. It did not welcome him. Thorns and thistles, things he had never before seen, sprang from the earth, their sharp points tearing at his skin, leaving angry red welts. He threw his entire weight into his makeshift tool, muscles straining, only to have it glance off the compacted dirt. He resorted to using his hands, digging and pulling at the stubborn weeds, their roots clinging to the earth as if to defy his very presence. As the sun climbed higher, beads of sweat formed on Adam's brow. They were salty, stinging his eyes as they trickled down his face. This was the first sweat of toil, an utterly foreign sensation. In the garden, his work had been a joyful act of tending and naming. Here, it was a battle, a desperate struggle for sustenance. Every rock he wrestled from the ground, every thorny bush he uprooted, served as a visceral reminder of his disobedience, of the price of a single, fateful choice. The physical exhaustion was a new and bitter feeling. It ached in his back, burned in his shoulders, and weighed heavily on his spirit. Not far away, Eve sat watching her husband, a different kind of pain awakening within her. She felt the weight of the judgment spoken directly to her. "I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing." She placed a hand over her womb, a tremor of fear, for a future she could not yet comprehend. But the ache was deeper than that. "Your desire shall be contrary to your husband, but he shall rule over you." Their perfect, equal partnership was gone. Her longing for Adam was now tangled with a new dynamic of hierarchy and potential conflict, a submission that had been alien to their original design. She watched him, weary and frustrated, and a wave of guilt washed over her. A single, hot tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek, falling onto the parched ground below. It was the first tear of regret, of sorrow for them both. She wept for the lost innocence, for the hardship her husband now endured because of her, and for the pain she herself was destined to bear. That tear, like Adam's sweat, was a sacrament of a fallen world. They were the tangible marks of their broken fellowship, the first drops in an ocean of suffering that humanity would inherit. Adam paused, seeing his wife's silent grief, and in that moment the chasm between them was bridged, not by words, but by a shared, weary sigh, a mutual acknowledgement of their loss and the unyielding reality of their new life. The act of blame in the garden, though fleeting, had carved a deep, invisible fissure into the soul of their union. Though they remained together, the only two humans in a vast and silent world, they were no longer one flesh in the seamless, pristine way they had been. Shame had become a constant, unwelcome third party in their relationship. Adam, laboring under the hot sun, would sometimes glance at Eve and, for a heart-wrenching moment, see not the companion God had fashioned for him, but the vessel of temptation, the catalyst that had plunged them into this desolate exile. A bitter thought, sharp as a thorn, would pierce his mind. If it were not for her, he would quickly banish it, but its poison lingered, tainting the purity of his love. He remembered his own words to God, "The woman whom you gave to be with me," an accusation that had implicated both Eve and the Creator. Those words now echoed back to him, creating a distance he did not know how to cross. For her part, Eve wrestled with a similar turmoil. When she saw the exhaustion etched on Adam's face, the frustration in his posture as he fought the unyielding ground, she was consumed by her role in their fall. Yet, deep within her, another question festered. Why did you not protect me? Why did you not stop me? She looked at Adam, the one created first, the one to whom the command was originally given, and felt a quiet pang of disappointment. He had been there, right beside her, yet he had been silent. His passivity was a failure as profound as her action. Their conversations became hesitant, fraught with unspoken things. They learned to navigate around the topic of the garden, avoiding any mention of their blissful past, for every shared memory was a potential landmine of pain. They were learning to live together in a new reality, one where trust was not an innate gift, but something that had to be painstakingly rebuilt upon the ruins of their perfection. Their physical intimacy, though it remained, could no longer fully mend the spiritual distance between them. Sometimes, even in an embrace, they felt a profound loneliness, each trapped in a private prison of regret. One evening, Adam found a wild blossom, its color pale compared to the vibrant hues of Eden, but a rare splash of beauty nonetheless. He picked it and brought it to Eve, a silent offering, an attempt to build a bridge across the chasm. Eve accepted it, a faint smile touching her lips. But as her fingers brushed against the petals, they were already limp, beginning to wilt. Unlike the eternal flowers of the garden, beauty here was fragile, fleeting. Together, they watched the flower die in her hands, a perfect, heartbreaking symbol of their own state. They had to learn forgiveness, not only for each other but for themselves, the hardest lesson of their exiled lives, a lesson their descendants would be forced to learn for millennia to come. Amidst the endless cycle of laborious days and long nights haunted by the ghosts of what if, a single, fragile thread held them together, keeping them from succumbing entirely to despair. It was a fragment of memory, not of Eden's beauty, but of the final words God had spoken in the garden, words directed not at them, but at the serpent. "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." What did these words mean? They could not grasp their full cosmic significance. Her offspring, was it to be their children? He shall bruise your head. Did it mean that one day the crushing dominion of deceit and sin would finally be broken? They pondered these words, debated their meaning, and sometimes, in the quiet of the night, simply held them in their hearts as a sacred mystery. In their deepest moments of hopelessness, when Adam returned from the field, his hands bleeding and his spirit weary, seeing only an endless future of struggle, Eve would gently remind him, "But he promised, When Eve wept silently in the darkness, mourning the spiritual chasm that now separated them from their Creator, Adam would take her hand and whisper, "An offspring will come. Someone will come." This cryptic prophecy became the bedrock of their fledgling, faltering faith. It planted in their minds the radical idea that their fall, as catastrophic as it was, might not be the final chapter. Perhaps God, even in his righteous judgment, had deliberately sown a seed of hope, a plan for redemption so vast that their finite minds could not possibly conceive of it. Yet, what was a promise in a world now defined by pain, death, and separation? Doubt was a persistent shadow. Had they misheard? Was the promise truly for them, or for some other beings in some other time? The waiting was agonizingly long, and there were no immediate signs of deliverance. Still, they had nothing else. They could only cling to it, like shipwreck survivors clinging to a piece of driftwood in a boundless ocean. That promise became the small, flickering flame that warmed them in the long night of their exile. It did not banish the darkness, but it cast just enough light for them to see the path immediately before them, one step at a time. And so, they continued their journey, bearing not only the burden of the past, but also the weight of a hope not yet realized. When Eve first felt the stirrings of new life within her, a complex tapestry of emotions unfurled. There was fear of the prophesied pain of childbirth, a pain she could not yet imagine. But interwoven with that fear was a powerful, surging hope. Was this it? Was the promise beginning to unfold? Was this the start of the offspring of the woman? The pains of labor, when they came, were as fierce and brutal as the curse had foretold. It was a visceral, tearing agony, a physical manifestation of the world's brokenness. Yet, the moment the first cry of a newborn split the primeval silence, all pain seemed to vanish, replaced by a wave of pure, overwhelming joy. She held her tiny son in her arms, and a delight unlike any they had known since Eden flooded the hearts of both Adam and Eve. "With the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man," Eve declared, her voice trembling with emotion. Within that statement lay the entirety of her belief. She had not simply borne a child. She believed she had gotten a man from the Lord, someone special, perhaps the very one who had been promised. Could this be the one? Could their son, Cain, be the Redeemer who would crush the serpent's head and reopen the gates to paradise? They poured all their hopes into him. Every milestone, every smile, every word from the boy was viewed through the lens of this monumental expectation. Adam taught Cain how to till the ground, not merely as a means of survival, but with a sense of profound purpose. He believed he was training the one who would ultimately conquer the cursed soil. Eve filled Cain's mind with stories of the garden, not as a lament for what was lost, but as a hopeful prelude to the day her son would lead them back. But their hope was tragically misplaced, a hope built on human longing for a swift resolution rather than patient trust in God's timing. They yearned for an immediate reversal of their mistake, a quick undoing of their tragic choice. They looked at Cain and saw a savior, failing to realize they were placing the weight of the world on the shoulders of a child. They were blind to the latent shadow within him, the seed of jealousy and violence that had been sown into human nature at the moment of their transgression. Cain grew up under this immense pressure. He sensed his own perceived specialness, but could not comprehend its source. His parents' expectations inadvertently fostered in him a sense of entitlement, a prideful belief that he was inherently deserving of God's favor. In their focus on the offspring, they neglected to instill in their son the virtues of humility and true obedience. They did not understand that God's plan of redemption was far grander, more complex, and would require a sacrifice far greater than they could ever imagine. And so, their initial joy, born of a desperate hope, unwittingly prepared the fertile ground for the tragedy that was to come. In time, another son, Abel, was born into their small family. Unlike Cain, who wrestled with the soil, Abel possessed a gentler spirit, drawn to the rhythms of the flock. He became a keeper of sheep. The divergence between the two brothers grew more pronounced with each passing season, a difference not just in vocation, but in the disposition of their hearts. Abel, with a heart of faith and reverence, brought the best of his firstborn lambs as an offering to God. Cain, in contrast, brought some of the fruits of the soil, an offering that perhaps lacked the same depth of devotion. Then, the unthinkable happened. God showed favor to Abel and his offering, but he did not show favor to Cain and his. Perhaps fire descended from heaven, a divine sign of acceptance upon Abel's altar, while Cain's offering remained untouched. For Cain, who had been raised to believe in his own preeminence, this was an unbearable slight. His face fell, and jealousy, like a feral beast, was unleashed in his soul. The shadow that Adam and Eve had cast upon the world in the garden now took root and flourished in the heart of their firstborn. God, in his mercy, spoke directly to Cain, warning him, "Sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." The warning, however, went unheeded. The beast of pride and rage was too strong to be tamed. The tragic day arrived. Out in the open field, under a sky that had once only witnessed harmony, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. The first human blood was shed, a dark crimson stain upon the very ground that was already cursed. For Adam and Eve, this was a blow more devastating than the loss of Eden itself. They had not only lost a beloved son, Abel, but they had lost another son to the darkness of his own heart. They were forced to confront the horrifying reality that their sin was not a self-contained event. It was a poison, a spiritual disease that had been passed to their children, multiplying and bearing the gruesome fruit of death within their own family. When they found Abel's lifeless body, Eve collapsed, her cries of anguish tearing through the quiet afternoon. Adam stood frozen, his shoulders slumping under a weight far heavier than 9 centuries of toil. He looked at Abel's peaceful face and saw the innocence that had been violently extinguished. He looked toward the horizon where Cain now wandered as a fugitive and saw a soul utterly lost. This was the most terrible echo of their sin, an echo that would reverberate through all of human history, a painful testament that once the door to sin is opened, it will never close on its own. In the aftermath of Abel's murder and Cain's banishment, a mournful silence settled over Adam and Eve's dwelling. Joy had been violently extinguished, and hope seemed to have been buried alongside their younger son. Adam worked the fields now, not with the weary resignation of the curse, but with the hollow emptiness of grief. Eve would often sit for hours, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon where the garden once stood, wondering if anything was left for them but sorrow and loss. The promise of an offspring of the woman now felt like a cruel, distant mockery. The years had taken their toll. Wrinkles, carved by time and sorrow, lined their faces. They had lost one son to death and another to the spiritual death of sin. The future of humanity, once a bright and limitless possibility, now seemed a dead end, a lineage tainted from its very inception. Yet, in their deepest despair, when they felt most abandoned, God, whom they feared had turned his back on them completely, once again showed his mercy. Eve conceived again. This time, there was none of the triumphant expectation that had accompanied Cain's birth. Instead, there was a quiet, cautious hope, a humble acceptance. When the boy was born, healthy and whole, tears streamed down Eve's face as she held him. These were not tears of regret, but tears of profound gratitude. She named him Seth, a name meaning appointed or substitute. Her words, full of both pain and comfort, were a prayer of recognition. God has granted me another child in place of Abel, since Cain killed him. Her declaration revealed a profound spiritual shift. She no longer said, "I have brought forth a man," as if it were her own achievement. but God has granted me, acknowledging the child as a gift of pure grace. Her hope was no longer vested in the child's potential, but in the faithfulness of the giver. The birth of Seth was more than just a solace for a grieving family. It was God's powerful reaffirmation of his promise. The line of redemption would not be severed by human jealousy or violence. Though humanity had failed, God's purpose remained steadfast. Through Seth, a new line of faith was established. The scriptures note that it was from the time of Seth's son, Enosh, that people began to call on the name of the Lord. This was a pivotal moment. The act of worship, of actively seeking God, was being restored in a world drifting further into darkness. Adam and Eve, now grandparents, watched Seth grow. They saw in him not a Messiah to fix their mistakes, but a new beginning, a single link in a great chain whose end they could not see. Hope, though still fragile and distant, was rekindled not by the fire of human ambition, but by the gentle, enduring light of divine grace. Centuries unfolded. For Adam and Eve, time was no longer measured by the peaceful cycles of day and night in the garden, but by the rhythm of sowing and reaping, by the lines etched deeper into their faces, and by the ever-expanding tapestry of their descendants. They aged, their hair turning white as frost, but their eyes held a profound wisdom, a wisdom bought at the terrible price of their transgression. They watched as their children, and their children's children, the lineage of Seth, multiplied and spread across the face of the earth. They witnessed the first cities being built, the first melodies being played on lyres and pipes, the first tools being forged from bronze and iron, the burgeoning of human civilization. But alongside this progress, they saw the shadow of sin lengthen and darken. The pride, violence, and corruption they had first seen in Cain now festered and grew in the hearts of many. The world they had opened to sin was descending deeper into chaos. Their existence was a constant paradox, a life lived between two realities. By day, they lived with the curse. Adam still toiled, his sweat watering the ground that yielded thorns as often as it yielded grain. Eve still felt the echoes of sorrow and the strain in human relationships. They witnessed sickness, pain, and eventually the finality of death claimed their loved ones, concepts utterly alien to their life in Eden. But by night, gathered around a crackling fire under a canopy of stars, they lived with the promise. They became the keepers of memory and hope. To each new generation, they recounted the story that must never be forgotten. They spoke of a perfect garden, a place of unbroken fellowship with the Creator. They warned of the serpent's cunning deceit, the subtle twisting of God's word. They confessed their own tragic fall. And most importantly, they passed on the promise, the prophecy of an offspring who would one day come, a Savior who would ultimately triumph over evil. Their story was no fairy tale. It was both a solemn warning and a beacon of encouragement. Their long lives were a living object lesson on the consequences of sin and the desperate need for grace. Adam, holding up his calloused hands, would point to the thorns and say, "This is the fruit of disobedience." Eve, her eyes filled with a sorrowful wisdom, would speak of Seth, of the godly line, and of a future she believed would be redeemed. They lived for over 900 years, standing as living monuments of history. They were the bridge between a perfect past and a hopeful future, even as their present was fraught with hardship. They did not know when the promise would be fulfilled, or how, but they held on to it. Their faith, forged in the crucible of regret and grief, had become resilient. They no longer looked for an immediate fix, but had learned to trust in a plan far greater than themselves, a plan that would span generations and culminate in a redemption beyond their imagining. And so they lived, and worked, and told their story, planting the seeds of hope in the hearts of the generations to come. Adam's final day arrived, not with a thunderous clap, but with the quiet fading of a long-burning ember. At 930 years old, he felt his life force waning. He lay upon his simple bed, surrounded by the faces of his descendants, the lineage of Seth. Eve was by his side, her aged hand holding his, the same hands that had toiled the cursed earth together for 9 centuries. In his mind's eye, Adam saw the vast panorama of his life, an epic journey from pristine innocence in the garden to the bitter regret of the fall, from walking in intimate fellowship with his Creator to a long exile in the wilderness of sin. He remembered the sheer joy of seeing Eve for the first time, the crushing sorrow of Abel's death, and the renewed hope with the birth of Seth. His life was a microcosm of the human story, created for perfection, fallen through disobedience, and sustained by a divine promise. As he drew his last breath, his body grew still. Adam, the man formed from the dust of the ground, returned to the dust, just as God had decreed. His death was the ultimate fulfillment of the judgment, an undeniable reminder to all present of the wages of sin. It was a solemn, sorrowful moment, the closing of an era, the passing of the first man. But the story of humanity did not end in that grave. The death of the first Adam only served to illuminate the profound need for the last Adam. The Bible's silence on the death of Eve, who likely passed away not long after, now reveals its deeper theological purpose. It is not an oversight, but a deliberate, artful shift in focus. While Adam's death symbolizes the entry of sin and judgment, Eve's legacy is not defined by her end. Her legacy is found in the continuation of life through her offspring. That silence directs our gaze away from a tomb and toward a cradle. It pivots the narrative from the finality of death to the promise of life. The line of the woman, the lineage that began anew with Seth, would continue to flow through the generations through Noah, Abraham, and David, ultimately leading to the birth of Jesus Christ. He, the last Adam, would live a life of perfect obedience. Through his death and resurrection, he would conquer sin and death once and for all, accomplishing what the first Adam failed to do. He would offer the gift of eternal life to all who believe, reopening the way to a new Eden, a place where separation from God is no more. The promise whispered in the garden so long ago, the promise that became Adam and Eve's only hope in their exile, was now on its path to glorious fulfillment. Adam's death was not the final tragedy, but a necessary chapter in a much greater story of redemption, a story that began with a tree in a garden and would find its ultimate triumph on a tree on a hill called Calvary.